upper lip with your bottom feet. That would be protraction. Retraction, moving the bone posteriorly along that transverse plane, bringing it back into position. Elevation and depression. Elevation, moving the bone superiorly along the coronal or frontal plane, and depression, moving the bone inferiorly along that coronal or frontal plane. So when we work with these protraction, retraction, elevation, depression, there's two joints that can do all four of those. So the first one we have are the shoulders. So you can do elevation, you can bring your shoulders up. You can do depression, bring your shoulders down. You can do protraction, bringing your shoulders forward. You can do retraction, bringing your shoulders back. Same thing with your jaw, up and down, and you can grind your teeth. So it gives us greater range of motion by being able to walk around and do these different times. Circumduction, evil arm circles. Okay, so when you use your limb to describe a cone in space, or you want to draw a circle. And of course, some of these we might be familiar with because a lot of times in PE class, when you had to do warm-ups before you started writing or something, you had to do some of these movements. You had to do arm circles and toe touchings. You're just going through the different movements, getting prepared to do work. Bless you. Rotation, turning a bone around its own action. So it doesn't draw a circle. It's like, using a screwdriver to put a screw in. It's just going to turn back and forth. That would be rotation. Supination, pronation. This is specialized rotation of the forearms only. So supination is palm up. It gets its name because to supplicate basically means to be not worthy. So when you supplicate, you kind of bow down to somebody. So palms up. Pronation, palm down. Okay, so that's going to face the palms posteriorly. Inversion, eversion, foot only. So inversion is turning the sole medially. So if you stepped in gum and you wanted to see if you stepped in gum, eversion is turning your sole laterally, so going back into position, and sometimes a little slightly over. Opposition, your thumb does opposition because it has that saddle joint. So that means you can touch the opposite fingers. So you can do more than flexion and extension and adduction. Adduction, you can touch those. And that's why we call them opposable thumbs. They can do opposition where the other fingers cannot. And then lateral flexion, side bends. So again, a lot of times back in PE class, you had to do the whole round whirl thing, right? Touch your toes, lean back, lean all the way back, do the side bends. Do they still do those in PE classes? I know in the late 80s, early 90s, they did. Back in the day. So those are your different types of movements. Right. Looking at specific articulations. So the first ones we're going to look at are the intervertebral discs. So again, those pads of fibrocartilage that are between each of the body of the vertebrae. And again, these are symphyseal joints. They're just there to help cushion and distribute body weight. They're not freely mobile or anything like that. So our intervertebral discs actually have layers to them. So they're built kind of like a Gushers fruit candy or Bubbaloo if you've ever had the bubble gum with the liquid on the inside of it. So around the outside, we have the annulus fibrosus. Annulus meaning one around, kind of like a year is annual. And then fibrosus, this is because it's made out of fibrocartilage. So this is around the outside of the intervertebral disc, made out of fibrocartilage, and it's going to give firmness to the intervertebral disc so it doesn't splatter or splat out anywhere. So preventing too much expansion when we compress upon it. The nucleus pulposus, again, nucleus means middle, pulposus means squishy stuff, so this is the squishy stuff in the middle. It is going to give the elasticity, the compressibility of the intervertebral discs. So just like the Gushers fruit candy, you can squeegee it because it's got the liquid in the middle. And there's those shoes that some of the soles will have, like they look like little air pockets or bubbles where there's the hard plastic and it's squished in the middle. It's the same principle. They got that idea from the intervertebral disc and how they're set up. Now, as we age, we're going to lose fluid within our joints. We actually lose a little bit of fluid within all of our joints. That's why as we get older, sometimes it's a little stiffer. It takes a minute for your joints to warm up in the morning kind of thing. But when we look at reduction of water, that is going to decrease the size of the tissue, decrease the size of that joint. So when you have an intervertebral disc, you'll lose a little bit of water as you age. That disc will get a little flatter, a little skinnier. So even if that one disc only lost 1/16 or 1/8 of an inch, when you add up every single intervertebral disc, losing an 1/8 or losing a 1/16, that can add up. So this is one of the reasons why people shrink as they get older. They may lose upwards of half an inch in height over time because each of those discs are getting smaller and smaller. Now, this one causes issues because when that disc is flatter, it's not as squishy as it used to be, so it's not going to be as supportive. Kind of like pillows that you've sat on too long or too flat, they don't really provide any support anymore, so they're not going to be very functional. And another problem we have is when you decrease the size of the joint, you decrease the range of motion. So if you're used to being able to move a whole lot and all of a sudden your space to move is smaller, you tend to injure yourself. So you try to do something you did a few years ago and you pull a muscle or you damage something. Usually they begin with fun things like, I used to do this in high school. That's code for go ahead and call the ambulance. It's going to be bad because we are not as mobile and flexible as we used to be. So we increase our chances of injury. Now, ligaments, tons and tons of ligaments to attach all the vertebrae together. Again, this is to make sure they stay in a nice little stack. We don't want them to slip or slide or anything like that. And that way, as we move around, they stay and maintain the proper positioning without a shift that could damage something. Now, the ligaments, even though there's lots and lots of tie downs, we still have mobility. So we can still do flexion and extension. You can touch your toes and you can stand up, do a little bit of hyperextension in some parts. Rotation, right? You can twist side to side, and you can do lateral flexion. You can do the side bends. So here, showing you those intervertebral discs, and they should be the same thickness all the way around. So they're going to have the fibrocartilage around the outside to give the firmness, and the squish in the middle with the nucleus pulposus. And this is showing you all those different ligaments. Again, we're not going to concern ourselves with all the ligaments because I don't want to, can't make me. But it's one of those things that if you were a chiropractor, this would be your bread and butter. So of course we got the anterior and the posterior longitudinal ligaments to keep everybody stacked properly. We've got the supraspinous and the infraspinous to keep these guys lined up properly. We got the ligamentum flavum. I picture it wearing a big clock and being stupid, going, yeah, boy. Remember him?
Flavum.
Flavor Flav. He used to be a hardcore rapper. Now he's a joke. He used to be gangster, apparently. He needs to cap some more people to get that reputation back. Not that he should kill people. He's just sad on damage. Again, our discs are so good at their job. Most of the time, people don't know about them, do anything until they're not good at their job, until they're damaged, and then they can cause major health issues for the individual. So we have two big issues, a slipped disc or a herniated disc. A slipped disc, on the street, sometimes this is called a bulging disc. So what happens, the annulus fibrosus will thin on one side, and this causes a bubble. When you put pressure on it, it squishes the middle into that thinned area, and it bulges. It has that big bubble on it, just like when you blow a bubble in bubble gum. The thinner the bubble gum, the bigger the bubble is going to be. By having that big bubble there, it can change the angle of the vertebrae, so it tilts when it's not supposed to. So that's going to interfere with weight transference. It can cause some pain and issues. If the bulge hits a nerve, that can cause problems with the functionality of that nerve. It can limit range of motion, can cause issues. While it's in the slipped disc stage, you can do physical therapies, you can do steroid shots to try to thicken up the annulus fibrosus to correct for that bulging disc. Now, if it keeps bulging, the bubble gets bigger and bigger. Eventually, the bubble's going to pop, just like when you're blowing a bubble with bubble gum. It gets bigger and bigger, and eventually, it'll get so thin that it pops and the air goes out of your bubble. In this case, you have a herniated disc. The nucleus pulposus squishes out. This is also called a ruptured disc. Okay, so this causes lots of problems because the squish, one, when you put the weight on it and it squishes outward, that means there's nothing to support that vertebrae in the weight transfer, so that's going to be problematic. Where it squishes out, if it squishes on a motor nerve, it can cause paralysis or partial paralysis or twitching. If it crushes on or bulges onto a sensory nerve, it can cause tingling, it can cause numbness, it can cause pain. And of course, when it squishes on one side, it presses on those nerves, which you change the angle of the spinal cord. That causes subsequent nerve pressure on the opposite side. So even though this one isn't being squished upon, it's tilted weird. So you can have the pain or the tingling or the numbness or the problems on the opposite side of the body as well. The only way that you can fix this is through surgery, because once you've popped, again, we can't fix the fibrocartilage. You have to go in and surgically get everybody's stuff back into place and sew it up. If the explosion, the pop is too big, it can't be salvaged, they'll just remove the entire disc and fuse those vertebrae together. So you'll lose the height of that disc and, of course, the mobility in that one region because they're going to fuse them together, because it's better that it doesn't move versus keep moving and breaking stuff. So here we have our picture form. So the normal intervertebral discs are the same height all the way around. Here's our slipped disc. We've got a bubble. In this picture, or in this case, this bubble's on this side, so it's not actually going to press too much on nerves. If it does, it's probably a sensory nerve, because most of the big boy nerves are coming out over here. But that's still going to cause problems with weight transference. If this slip disc happened a little bit further back, then it could cause some issues with the nerves by pressing on them. Here on this side, we've got the ruptured disc or herniated disc, so the squish. So we're pressing directly on this nerve. So this side is suffering with either pain or tingling or numbness or paralysis. And we can see here the spinal cord kind of torqued in there, it tilts. And that's going to cause the opposite nerves to hit on areas they're not supposed to, causing interference with their functionality. So this person is going to be very hindered with their ability to move around, to do their day-to-day activities. So again, they could try to restuff and sew it back up to provide stability. And if that's not a possibility, we'll just remove all the tissue and fuse you together. Your shoulder joint, it is very, yes.
Sorry. So does it just hurt in one side of the back or like the whole back?
So it depends on who they push on. So this one, you're going to have problems on both sides because it's actually pressing here, but it's twisted. So now this nerve is pressing down here where it's not supposed to. So you've got pressure on all sides. So it'd be pinching on both sides. So you would have issues on both sides of the body. Now, depending on which part this is, this can be more traumatic. If this was lower down in the spinal cord, it could cause leg paralysis where you wouldn't be able to put weight on your legs or anything like that. So it just depends on which section we're hitting, which part gets a problem. So if this was around your shoulders, upper neck area, you wouldn't be able to use your arm.
You said they fuse the spine together in that
The
one area.
vertebrae.
The vertebrae.
Mm-hmm.
So would they like plates and screws?
So basically, they just take this big chunk off and set it directly on it and fuse them together. So they remove the joint completely.
And just let it grow together?
Yeah, so once they do that, they'll stabilize it. So they'll keep it together, but the bones eventually will fuse completely.
Okay.
Just like a broken bone is going to heal. Each of these have periosteum on it, so they're just
Will that
fuse
area be a little stronger, or will it be more susceptible to breakage?
If it was completely solid over time, it would be very strong, but you're not going to have any kind of movement associated with it. So you would have stiffness in that area. You wouldn't have the same mobility. So if this happened in the neck region, you wouldn't be able to move your neck. You would just have to face whatever direction that you are looking at. So it's going to be a hindrance to mobility. So our shoulder is super duper flexible. Again, it's a ball and socket joint, so we do have that movement along that entire area. Now with the shoulder, it's a little bit more flexible than typical because the glenoid cavity, instead of being a big cup holding the entire head of the humerus, it's more like a saucer. So that head has a lot more wiggle room, a lot more flexibility, which is why you can scratch the middle of your back with your hand if you want to. But unfortunately, when we look at it, the more mobile something is, the more likelihood it can dislocate, the more fragile it's going to be because you don't have the stability because you have the flexibility. So it's a very weak type of joint. So it's weak because the glenoid cavity isn't a complete cup. It's weak because it's going to rely mostly on muscles and ligaments to keep this shoulder joint intact. And if you don't have good muscles, that's going to put a lot of strain on those ligaments and you're more likely to pull or tear something. So when people have rotator cuff injuries, they've torn their rotator cuff, that kind of scenario, it could be the soft tissue damage, it could be tearing to the actual cartilage associated with this joint, a lot of problems that way. So you're more likely to have issues like a dislocated shoulder and injuries to your shoulder because it's not very stable. So we sacrifice stability for flexibility.
So if you're not consistently like exercising on a weekly or daily basis, probably shouldn't be doing strenuous activity that could throw that out.
Yeah, and that's usually what happens is you'll have people doing normal day-to-day stuff and then try to lift something too heavy and it puts too much strain and they tear something. So you got to keep up your use at a high enough level that when you go to do something crazy, it's not going to be something so different than the norm.
Should I be careful throwing a football since I don't go to the gym every day, or playing baseball on the holidays with my family? I'm just curious. I was like, because one time I was throwing the football and this whole area was so sore after the next day. I was like, what
Because
happened?
your ligaments got micro tears because your muscle wasn't there to support it. So you sprained it. So
Okay.
just like if you sprained an ankle because you stepped in a hole.
Mhm.
So if you do that once a year, but you sit around and play video games or just sit on your couch for the rest of the year, you're not providing the support it needs. Same thing happens whenever you'll have those people that are couch potatoes and they decide to go play football for one day or who knows what. I used to do this in high school. And you're like, injury, here it comes. And you got to have the muscles to support those joint tissues.
Okay.
Elbows. Elbows are some of your most stable joints that you have in the body. So if you've ever taken a self-defense class, they'll often tell you don't kick a perpetrator, because that's what most of us want to do. Is like, I'll kick him in the crotch and run. Sounds great unless you injure your knee during that time and then you're limping and they're going to be angry when they catch you. But if you use your elbow, it's very hard to dislocate your elbow. It's a very stable joint, so you can use it as a weapon quite efficiently in case you want to go around and stab people with your elbow. It's super stable because one, the bones interlock, right? You've got the trochlear notch that has the olecranon process and the coronoid process on your ulna. Your humerus fits into that. So the trochlea fits in that notch. When you straighten the elbow, the olecranon process fits into the olecranon fossa, locking it in place. When you bend your elbow, the coronoid process fits into the coronoid fossa, locking it in place. So very good mechanical structure-wise, keeping things together. Plus, it has a very thick joint capsule surrounding all that, lots of ligaments connecting everybody together. So it's very, very hard to dislocate. Yes, ma'am.
So if something interlocks, like a phone's interlocked, that automatically makes it more stable.
Yeah, because if you're stuck together, it's hard to dislocate it. But if you're not stuck together, it's easier to move. So what we talked about yesterday, the 3 things that maintain the stability of the joints: articulating surfaces, muscle tissue, and ligaments. So if you've got really good articulating surfaces, these guys don't have to be as great, and you're still stuck together because bones are pretty hard. Our hip is very, very sturdy, very, very stable, because of course we've got good articulations. The acetabulum makes a complete bony cup. You can't dislocate up, you hit a bone. You can't dislocate down or in, you hit a bone. When you dislocate the hip, it has to come out in almost a perfect angle to do that. And it's hard for that to happen because there's lots and lots of ligaments tying everybody together. There's a lot of muscles. You've got ab muscles, back muscles, hip muscles, all kinds of stuff all the way around. And then we even have fun little bungee cords attached. So that fovea capitis, that hole in the head, has a really big ligament stuck to it that attaches it to the inside of the acetabulum. It's kind of like back in the day, if you had one of those toys, I always saw it as the ice cream toy, but there was also a gun version where you had like an ice cream cone with a foam ball, and you squeeze the cone and the ball shoots off, but it's connected by a string so you don't lose it, so you can just pop it back on and shoot it at somebody else. And there was a gun version of that. I know, back in the day, toys before they were electronics, we just hit each other with foam balls. Okay, so that tether makes sure that even if you were to dislocate the hip, it were to remove the head of the femur from the acetabulum, it's still tethered by that little ligament, that cord going from the head of the femur going to the center of the acetabulum. And that's what it's showing you up there. They had to sever it so you could see it well. That's going to keep it in place so it doesn't shift too much either way because it's still tethered. Because it's super stable, it's not as flexible as your shoulder. So again, you usually can, scratch the back of your head or your back with your hands. You can't really scratch your ears with your feet. Not super flexible compared, because we're getting stability instead of getting flexibility. And your knee is very complex. You should read it for lab or something. Disorders. So the end of this chapter. So luxation. Luxation is the fancy way to say dislocation. Because again, it's science. They're doctors. It sounds so much fancier when your doctors talking to each other like, oh, he luxated his elbow. Like, ooh, that sounds bad. If I just said dislocated, it'd be like, pop it back into place. So luxation sounds cool. Subluxation, partial dislocation. So when you jam a finger, that's subluxation. You shifted that joint and you had to pop it back into positioning. When you are double jointed, and we'll discuss it more on the next slide, double jointed people are more flexible, and the more flexible, the more likely you can dislocate something. So if you do yoga or gymnastics, it's easier for you to dislocate something like your hip than if you don't, because you're more flexible, the ligaments are more stretchy, more likelihood to fall out of positioning. So you're not as stable. The ACL, again, anterior cruciate ligament. In lab, we got to use the full terms. We can't say ACL or PCL or LLQ or anything like that. We got to have the full word, so I know you know what you're saying. So your anterior cruciate ligament, it heals fairly poorly. One, it's dense regular connective tissue, so it's already kind of behind the 8 ball there. It's not going to heal well. It doesn't have a lot of blood vessels. Being isolated inside of the knee joint in that cavity there, it's even further isolated to blood vessels, nutrient distributions, and such. Plus, the way it stabilizes the knee joint from the inside, when it's torn, you lose the stability. Things shift more, so it's harder for it to heal because it keeps shifting and moving. So it's just going to make the tear worse and worse. So most of the time, it requires a ligament graft to surgically repair it. So when they do ligament grafts, they harvest some local ligaments. So they may get some from around the knee. So usually the patellar ligament. If we don't want to destabilize the knee, they'll just harvest some from the calcaneal tendon because that's a really big tendon. So it's got lots of connective tissues, and you just slice it in. Okay, it's kind of like putting a patch on your hole on your pants. I don't know, imagine today if people patched the holes in their jeans instead of just wearing them as fashion accessories. But whenever you put a patch over that and sew it in, keeping it stable, keeping it together. Okay, so your surgeons are really good seamstresses. They do hem like crazy because that's part of their job, basically. Sprains, again, we talked about yesterday. When you're stretching a ligament, it can only stretch 6% before we start getting micro tears. So those micro tears might be painful for a couple of days because they're injuries, but they're microscopic injuries. If we keep pulling, we keep stretching, it's going to keep tearing, and the tears are going to get bigger and bigger. And if the tears are really big, it's going to take a long time to heal. And of course, if it's really big and it completely ruptures, flappy pieces are never going to heal back together. So they have to be kind of spliced back together. So if you have a mild sprain, it may take 6 to 8 weeks of not moving it so much. Don't put a whole lot of weight on it, let it heal. But a lot of times, if it's a severe one, they're going to have to surgically repair them, especially if they've separated completely. So they can work out. And of course, as mentioned, they have to have the surgery to help them out if it's severe, because we don't have a lot of vascularization. It takes a long time for this tissue to heal, and it has to be pretty stable for it to heal. Okay, so so sometimes when you do severe sprains, slice those ligaments as they're healing, or they can repair them surgically and then minimize or lessen that heal time. Now, sprains are very common in the ankle because there's lots of connective tissue in the ankle region of the body. And of course, if you step wrong, you can sprain it. Most of us have probably sprained our ankle at least once in our lives, minor at least, and sometimes severe. Your knee, because again, lots of ligaments, lots of tendons, not a lot of protection for that area of the body. And your lumbar spine. This is usually what most people, they're like, oh, I'm okay until I lifted something heavy 5 years ago, and now my back just feels weird. It's not the same as it used to be. It's sore in the morning. That is actually really bad spraining of your lumbar spine if you don't lift properly. That's why we always say lift with your legs and not your back. Because when you sprain the lumbar spine, you have to keep it completely still for it to heal properly without any kind of help. And we're not completely still. We wiggle. So that's why your back might hurt for quite a long time, or might take a while for that pain to subside, because you may have little micro tears and all those ligaments associated with that region. Yes, ma'am?
So if you sprain something like your ankle, for instance,
Mhm.
will you be prone to sprain that again throughout your lifetime? Like, will it make it weaker?
It depends. If it was a mild sprain, you'll have scar tissue there. If it's a severe sprain and it was spliced back together, where the sutures or stitches are, they're going to be a little bit weaker in that location. So if you did a severe enough to require surgery, you might be weaker from that point on. If it's a mild sprain, you may have a little more weakness because you did stretch before you tear. And once it's stretched severely, it may take a while to rebound all the way back. So you may be more susceptible for at least the first few weeks as it's still healing, because you could just do more micro tears to it if your weight goes on it. But 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, you're probably not going to notice a lot of differences unless it's really severe. Now you may notice changes. So like I had a really wicked sprain to my ankle. Well, someone dropped a railroad tie on me. It was, don't get me started on that person. But anywho, it scraped the side and that area is still swollen even though it's been 15 years. So the scars are still there and it still feels weird if you touch it because some of the nerves died. But it's still in the process of reworking itself. It'll linger if it's really bad. Cartilaginous injuries. Remember, they don't repair because one, cartilage is avascular, so we can't deliver nutrients to the cells, so the cells can't heal themselves or multiply to help heal the tissue. And as we learned yesterday, the synovial cartilage, the hyaline cartilage that we have the synovial membrane hanging out around, doesn't have any perichondrium, doesn't have any cells that can heal it anyway. So there is no cartilage repair in a joint. So any kind of injury, cartilaginous, has to be fixed surgically. So if you tear your medial meniscus, lateral meniscus, there is no, well, we'll just let it get better. No, it won't get better. It's either permanent limp or surgery. And sometimes even with surgery, you get a little bit of a permanent limp with that thing. So you do have to have arthroscopic surgery on any cartilaginous damage. Bursitis, we mentioned it last time, but since we've talked about bursa, we're going to talk about it again. So again, this is inflammation of a bursa. This can be due to injury, this can be due to friction, it can be due to trauma, it can be due to disease, lots of causes. Last test, we talked about student's elbow and tennis elbow. Your most common type of bursitis is actually a bunion. So at the base of your big toe, there is a bursa there to help cushion that as we pivot off of our big toe while we walk. So everybody's got that bursa. If you irritate that bursa because maybe your shoes are too small or you're wearing pointy-toed shoes instead of boxy-toed shoes. So we see a lot of surgeons in bunion problems when the pointy-toe shoes are in style, like the Jimmy Choos and stuff like that. You'll have more bunion issues because they squeeze the toe and they rub on the outside of your big toe. If you wear a boxy kind of toed shoes, boots versus pointy toes, you do better. Okay, so make sure you got room for your toes to move around in and make sure you're wearing the right size shoe. If you're wearing a shoe that's too small, even a half a size too small can cause a lot of irritation and friction on that bursa, which can lead to a bunion, which gets to be a big lump. It's not very attractive looking. And then you have to wear flip-flops or really big shoes because they're not fitting in anything that's going to be tight. Now, a bunion, again, if it's mild, we can do over-the-counter physical therapies, essentially. So they make special cushions for your bunions. You can put anti-inflammatory cream on it to help reduce the swelling of the area like you would a rash. Advil, Aleve to help alleviate the pain, that kind of scenario. If it's bad, the only way to get rid of it is surgery, because again, they do have to go in and remove that tissue and the fluid and so forth. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people misunderstand what a bunion is. They think it's the same thing as a corn, which is not. A corn is just a thick area of skin. So you'll have those people like, oh, I went and got a pedicure and they removed my bunion for me. It's like, I don't think they offer that in the foot spa because that requires like surgery and things. So if you don't get your bunions removed while you're awake, unless, no, you don't. You got to be put under. They got to cut it open, remove it, that kind of stuff. So caused by those tiny shoes. Wear normal shoes that fit your feet. Buy a size bigger if necessary. If you just have to have the cutesy kind of shoes. And then adventitious bursa. Sometimes you get a bursa in a weird spot. It's one that's not common. It's not like the student's elbow that everyone's getting. And when it's in a weird spot because maybe something specifically you do, whether it's a repetitive action at your job that caused that bursitis, or you sit weird causing that bursitis, what have you. We just call it adventitious because we're not going to name every single one out there. So that just means in an area that's not normal. Arthritis, again, talked about it before, hundreds of types, inflammatory, degenerative, pain, stiffness, swelling, all that kind of fun stuff. And then double jointed people. You actually still have the same number of joints as everybody else because to be double jointed, you have extra bones. You don't have extra fingers or anything like that. So what happens is you have the normal joint, but the ligaments associated with that joint are stretchier. So if they're stretchier, you get greater range of motion. And again, if you have greater range of motion, greater flexibility, more likelihood to dislocate it. Okay? So that fun party trick you might be able to show because you have double jointed elbows or double jointed shoulders, that just means you're more likely to dislocate it or break it as you age because you're more flexible than the average person. Question about joints? All right, moving on to muscle tissue. Right? So if you've talked around or talked to people that have survived ANP1, a lot of times if you ask them, what's the hardest thing to learn in ANP1? 9 times out of 10, they're going to say the sliding filament theory or action potentials. So how do muscle cells work or how do the nervous system works. So these are our biggest, hardest concepts that we're going to have in ANP. And it's not because conceptually they're hard. They're not that crazy. It's the fact that it's kind of foreign. When you talk about how lungs breathe, we can kind of picture lungs working. We picture stomachs when they're digesting. We have an idea of that ahead of time. When we're looking at the sliding filament theory and how muscles contract, we're talking about the little level. So when we talk about muscles contracting, we talk about what happens at the sarcomere level. What is the I band and the A band doing? What is myosin and actin doing? And those regulatory proteins for myosin and actin. So because they're so tiny, it's hard for a lot of people to kind of picture them working together because it's the first time we've seen actin and myosin and tropomyosin and troponin and all these terms that we don't usually talk about in everyday life. So that can make it a little bit more difficult. Plus, it is a step-by-step process. So this has to happen first, then this, then this, then this. So if you forget this, everything else doesn't work. So you have to know how everything fits, all the structures, the functions of the structures, how they interact with each other, and what happens if they don't interact like they're supposed to. So because of that, a lot of times it's kind of a hard concept because it's foreign and it takes a lot of detail. Okay? So in order to understand how muscles contract, you have to know all the parts of the muscles and how they fit together and how they're supposed to function together. It's kind of like if you want to rebuild an engine from scratch, you first have to know all the engine parts and how they put together. And then once you put it together, if you didn't do it right, your engine doesn't start. Okay, so you have to know all those details. So this is one of those concepts you're not going to get at the first read through. If you read it 3 or 4 times and by the 4th time you're done reading, you can recognize the word the and a, you're normal. Okay. This isn't something that someone can read through once and be like, oh, I understand everything. And if you do, we'll worship you later. Most of us take time. You've got to marinate in this information. You just can't glance and go. You really have to work with it. You really have to study it for a long period of time to get it all to soak in. Unfortunately, this is an 8-week class, so your marinating time is kind of cut in half. But you still got to, work with the material. It is doable. It's just going to take an effort. Okay? It's just not going to come to you like some of the other content or concepts. Okay? So don't be discouraged if you're reading through it and it's like, wow, this just doesn't even seem like a real language. If it takes a while to understand. Right? It took us 2 days in lab to identify all the parts of the models, and that's about a halfway learning about muscle tissue. Okay, so this is a really bad pep talk. I wasn't a cheerleader for lots of reasons, but one of them is, go team. You can do it. Rob Schneider holding the sign saying you can do it. Okay? It's possible. You just got to work for it. It's not going to just fall in your lap and you're going to miraculously know everything. You're going to have to put in the effort. The nice thing is there is a weekend between now and your test. Again, this is why I don't give pep talks. You've got a weekend. So looking at our muscles, of course, we've got 3 different types of muscles, skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. So skeletal muscle, this is our only voluntary muscle. You can control it, tell it what to do, make it do what you want. Again, it is striated, has the A bands, I bands, light areas, dark areas. It is multinucleated, so often hundreds of nuclei, and they are the longest of the muscle cells, because when you're a big cell, you're going to have a lot of nuclei to control your day-to-day activities. Some of the cells are over a foot in length, okay? So it just depends on how tall you are, how big those muscle cells happen to be. They are adaptable. If you want to run marathons, you train to run marathons and you go do that. If you want to power lift, you go to the gym and you train to power lift, right? Marathon runners look very different than gym rats that power lift and stuff like that, right? Yeah, marathon runners look like skeletons. That's because their muscles are adapted not for big strength, but to run, okay? Big strength does not run. Okay? That's why you never see that happening. So you can outrun the big boys because they don't got the right endurance because their muscles are adapted for what activities they want to do. The muscles use a lot of energy, a lot of ATP. And because they're so dependent on that ATP and they use so much of it, they do tire easily, right? Every now and then we just got to stop and take a breather. Okay? This is the only one we can do that. No one does that in the middle of a buffet going, I'm sorry, I just can't digest anymore. No? This is the only one that can poop out. Cardiac muscle, it is involuntary. It is still striated. It has A bands and I bands, but there's a slight difference in how it's set up. The cells are also branching, so they can generate a pumping motion instead of a pulling motion like our skeletal muscles. They're able to do spontaneous contraction. They don't have to be told what to do from the nervous system. You can cut off somebody's head and their heart will keep going. That's why chickens can run around like a chicken with their head cut off. Their heart's still beating the entire time until they run out of nutrients and energy. So your cardiac muscle is going to make up your heart. Smooth muscle, also involuntary, right? Can't stop your tumbling from rumbling if it's quiet. They are going to be the smallest of the muscle cells, uninucleated, single nucleus in the middle of their little spindle-shaped cells. And they are very slow to react. It's not instant. So when you go to the bathroom, it takes 3 to 10 hours for food to go from the beginning of your large intestines to the end of your large intestines. And that's just one part of the digestive system. So when you poop, you're not pooping lunch. You're probably pooping last night's dinner. Okay? It takes a while to work through the system because these guys aren't in any kind of hurry. They're slowly moving stuff through. So they're going to be found in the walls of your hollow organs, digestive, respiratory, urinary, reproductive tracts, blood vessels, hair follicles. Hair follicles are the only quick ones really that are out there. Now, when we look at this chapter, the big bulk of this chapter is dealing with skeletal muscles, because this is when we learn about our skeletal muscles, the parts of the skeletal muscles, how they work, all that kind of fun stuff. Cardiac muscle, you're just going to get a little bit of a blurb, and that's because you've got A&P2 and an entire chapter for the heart muscle to learn about the heart muscle and how the heart muscle works. So you'll do that for A&P2. Smooth muscle, we're basically just doing compare and contrast. So how are smooth muscles similar to skeletal muscles? How are smooth muscles different than skeletal muscles? But the bulk of your use of that information and detail of that information is going to be A&P2 when you get to the organ systems dealing with skeletal or smooth muscle activity. So we're just using smooth muscle for a little bit of this chapter as a counterpoint to the skeletal. So stuff you'll learn now, you'll be seeing in A&P2 when you get to the heart chapter and when you get to this rest of the chapters. So your teacher will probably say, you know, you learned this in A&P1. I say that a lot in A&P2. And then I get a little bit of sadness because people are like, no, you should have, but okay, let's remind you. So functions of our muscles. First and foremost, movement. Muscles make movement, whether it's heart pumping or peristalsis or pulling, we've got movement. Stabilizing body position and posture, that's skeletal muscle, right? They're connected to your skeleton so they can hold your skeleton up. So if you're sitting up straight, the muscles are contracting more than if you're slouching and slumping over. So they're going to dictate the positioning of your body. Supporting soft tissues, that is also a skeletal muscle thing. Your abs hold in your organs so that you don't sneeze and they fall out, because, you know, that would be awkward. So we're to keep all those organs in place and support those organs within. Controlling and guarding body entrances and exits. So most people think of the obvious skeletal muscle things, right? Your mouth hole is going to protect that end. Your anus is going to protect the other end. The external anal sphincter and the external urethral sphincter, those are skeletal muscles, so you can control when you pee and poop. But we also have a lot of smooth muscle sphincters. You have an internal anal sphincter, and you have an internal urethral sphincter that kickstarts things. You've got a sphincter going from the esophagus to the stomach to the small intestine to the large intestine. They act as gatekeepers between the organ systems, so you just can't drop something in your mouth and it falls right out the butt. That would be weird. Okay, it's going to take a little while to get through because they have to open and close doors all the way down. So even though there are obviously skeletal muscle guardings of entrance and exits, the vast majority are actually internal. So they're going to be smooth muscle sphincters that you can't control. Thermogenesis. When we use ATP, we're going to fuel muscle contraction. That is going to generate body heat as we break that ATP down. So it is a calorogenic effect. So, of course, when we get cold, we know that if we shiver, we warm up, right? If you're cold and you move around or you exercise, you get warmer. So a big chunk of thermogenesis for the body's temperature, again, comes from skeletal muscle activity, moving around, burning ATP, generating body heat. And a fun remembered thing is when we look at skeletal muscles, a skeletal muscle is an organ in the skeletal muscle system. So your biceps brachii is an organ, your triceps brachii is an organ. This is one of the biggest organ systems we have. We have over 700 named skeletal muscles. So that's a lot of organs within this organ system. And of course, being organs, they're going to have skeletal muscle tissue, but they're going to have connective tissues. They're going to have blood vessels going to them, nerves going to it. So that makes it an organ because it has more than one tissue type. So we're going to start with the connective tissues. Okay, so familiar from what we looked at in lab. So from the outside in, we start with the fascia. So our fascia is usually areolar connective tissues with some adipose pockets in them to help provide nutrients for the system as well as cushioning for the systems. So we'll have the connective tissue covering, supporting, separating muscles. And we have two layers. We've got the superficial fascia, which we already talked about with the skin. That's the same as the subcutaneous layer or the hypodermis. That's what you make, pork rinds out of. So it's got the areolar connective tissue with pockets of fat associated with it. So it's our big separator between the major organ system of muscles and the major organ system of the integument. Then we have deep fascia. Deep fascia is deeper in, I know, shocking, deeper. They're going to separate muscle groups from each other. So when you have the quadriceps femoris group, that's 4 muscles that likes to work together in unison. Now, those 4 individual muscles will have connective tissue separating them. So if you have an irritation of one, it doesn't affect the other guys. And that's your deep fascia. So a lot of times your superficial fascia, deep fascia, if you were looking in the meat world, this would be like good marbling for your meat. Okay, that marbling is fat pockets within the fascia that you're looking at. So when you cook your steak that has a lot of marble, has a lot of fat in the deep fascia, it melts and makes the steak very juicy and flavorful. Okay, so marbling happens with your deep fascia. Then we have epimysium. Again, epi means on top or superficial. Mysium meaning muscle. So this is the layer of connective tissue directly around each individual muscle. So if we had the quadriceps femoris group, each of those 4 muscles, rectus femoris, vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, vastus intermedius, would have their own epimysium separating them from each other. It is going to have collagen fibers to give support and stability. It helps to, again, keep everybody from bothering anybody else separating them. Whenever you prep meat, if you remove the silver skin off of your rack of ribs or something like that, some of that silver skin is epimysium, a little bit of it is deep fascia, depending on the cut of meat you're looking at. Perimysium is going to cover a bundle of muscle cells. That bundle of muscle cells is called a fascicle. So those cells like to work together as a unit, allows them to generate more contraction, more force. So whenever you pull pork or chicken or anything like that, what falls apart, those are the fascicles. So you can actually see them when you cook properly. They're going to separate from each other when you're shredding up your meat to make whatever dish you're doing. It's going to have collagen fibers. It's going to have more elastic fibers than your epimysium because it has to be able to recoil once the muscle cells are done contracting or the fascicle is done contracting. We'll also have more blood vessels and nerves lining up to go to those muscle cells. Then we have the endomysium, endo inside, mysium muscle. So inside around the cells, those are the ones we see on the muscle cell models in lab. So they're going to separate each cell from each other. They also help to embed and secure satellite cells. Satellite cells are repair cells. So if you tear a skeletal muscle cell, you went to the gym and you pulled something too much, the satellite cell has to do the repairs. That's why sometimes it'll take a while to repair muscle, because a muscle can't fix itself. That muscle cell has to be rebuilt using satellite cells, kind of like having to put together Lego stuff after someone broke your Lego thing. We also have the nerve fibers coming in. So that neuromuscular junction, that synaptic end bulb adjacent to the motor end plate, it is secured and held in place by the endomysium. So the nerve doesn't separate from the muscle, because if they separated, the muscle would be dead in the water. You'd be paralyzed. It wouldn't be able to contract. So we want to maintain the connectivity between that neuron and the muscle so we can function properly. And so if we were going to draw a crappy picture, because everybody loves crappy pictures. Yeah, we do. crappier the better. Good news. So we've got our muscle cell. Okay. And again, it's sometimes referred to as a muscle fiber because in the skeletal muscle they are long and fibrous. Around each of those muscle cells, again, you're going to have endomysium. Okay. And the collagen fibers of the endomysium trail past the cell. So they don't end at the end of the cell, they keep dangling past that point. Okay. So you'll have around each cell, you'll have the endomysium. And when we have a bundle of muscle cells that work together, that bundle of muscle cells is a perimysium. Okay, so around a fascicle, perimysium. I need to make my things longer. And then, of course, we will have several fascicles that will be making up our muscle. And then around the outside of the entire muscle as an organ, you're going to have epimysium. And as mentioned, as we trail off of the cells, off of the fascicle, off of the muscle, those collagen fibers continue. And they continue all the way to the connection point. So in this case, we'll draw a bone. And we're just going to continue on and fuse to the periosteum. And you'll notice these collagen fibers are all parallel. So what do we call parallel collagen fibers that connect muscle to bone? Tendon. Okay. That's why tendons are made out of dense, regular connective tissue. It's all the trailing edges of those collagen fibers of the endomysium, perimysium, epimysium, where they fuse over here. And by fusing to the periosteum of the bone, it ensures that no matter how hard we pull, we're not going to separate the muscle from the bone. Okay, you have to cut it off if you want to remove that muscle. And because we have collagen fibers associated at every level, it helps us to vary the strength. So if we just contract a couple of muscle cells, we might slightly pull. Okay? If we contract a few fascicles, we might pull a little bit harder. If we contract everybody, we're going to generate a really big pull. So it's one of the reasons why you can have different movements. The strength it takes to pick up a pen is very different than the strength it takes to pick up your book, very different than the strength it takes to pick up your 50-pound bag of dog food. Okay? We're able to harness different levels at different intensities so we can have the differences in strength. It's very similar to if you have a horse-drawn carriage. If you have 6 horses, all 6 horses are tied to that carriage. You just don't tie one horse down and everybody else is there for moral support, right?
Right.
Okay? All the horses are attached, so we can harness the pull from all of those horses. We're going to harness the pull from all those cells. Again, I might crap up. Okay. So again, that continuous collagen fiber from the epimysium, perimysium, endomysium is going to give us our collagen fibers going parallel, connecting muscle to bone, giving us our tendon. Not all muscles are attached to bones. Sometimes they're attached to each other. So that would be an aponeurosis. You would just draw another muscle over here instead of a femur to represent what an aponeurosis is. So it's the same tissue, same directionality. It's just the anchor is going to be different between them. And as we learned, we sometimes have tendon sheaths, right? Which are just elongated bursa that act as packing peanuts around the outside. So as it's moving around, it doesn't generate friction or anything like that. Okay, there's the professional picture. I know they paid those people to draw. So here we can see the deep fascia around the outside, the epimysium around the entire muscle, the perimysium around each fascicle, and the endomysium around each muscle cell. Now, the slice here, here's a nice piece of ham steak. So if you've ever seen ham steak, all it is pig thighs, thick pig thighs. But when you eat those, again, you've got the quadriceps femoris group, you've got the hamstrings group, you've got the adductor group. Around the outside of that pig thigh, your ham steak, You usually have a film there, right? That's your superficial fascia. Melts good, tastes great. We'll have all that connective tissue around each of the big muscle groups. Again, when you cook your ham steak, a lot of times that kind of just melts away and you get the big circlets of meat. Circlets of meat. I'm ready for dinner. Around each individual muscle, we would have our epimysium. And if you squint, you can actually see the fascicles. So fascicles are very easy to see in uncooked meat because you haven't melted the tissue yet. So with ham steak, it's against the grain, so you can see those circles. Those are the perimysium covered fascicles. You can also see them in filet mignon and other certain cuts like that. The endomysium is the only one that you cannot see with the naked eye because it's on individual cells. But perimysium, epimysium, deep fascia, you can see them in a cut of meat. You can see them with the naked eye. So the next time you're in the meat market area, go check out the parts of your cuts of meat. Identify them. Delicious. So functional characteristics of muscle. So we have 4 different characteristics that we're going to have. First is irritability, and it's not the I had to come to school today irritability. No, that one's a constant. This is the ability to receive a chemical stimulus, to transmit that stimulus and respond to that stimulus. So a skeletal muscle can receive a neurotransmitter from the neuron. In response to that, it will send an action potential down the cell membrane, transmitting that stimulus, and it will come into the T2, goes into the cell so we can have muscle contraction. So receiving it, transmitting it, and responding to it. Only our muscles and our nervous tissue can do irritability. Okay? We usually see the word responsiveness in neural tissue, but it's the same thing. Contractility, the ability to contract. I know, shocking. The ability to shorten and thicken. So only muscles have contractility. And they're able to do the force to do work because they have those contracting organelles, the actin and myosin and so forth. Extensibility and elasticity. Unfortunately, a lot of people get these confused with each other because we often misuse the word elastic. Okay, because a lot of times if you ask somebody what does elastic means, they'll say stretchy. It's not the case, right? Elastic actually means coming back. Because if your underwear loses elasticity, it'll stretch, but it won't recoil. Okay? Or your sweatpants will stretch and they won't recoil. Or if you get a hair band, when it loses its elasticity, the elastic band breaks. It's just a circle of fabric that won't keep your hair up anymore. Okay, so extensibility is the ability to be stretched. You can extend with extensibility. Elasticity is after you stretch, you go back to your original shape. So you don't have to worry about having a yoga class and having to hold and pull your muscles because you're overstretched those muscles. Okay, so you regain your shape after you've been stretched out. So looking at the anatomy of our skeletal muscles. So for a big chunk of this chapter, it's just going to be skeletal muscle stuff. So again, these are huge cells. Thigh muscles can be over 12 inches. Your longest muscle is the sartorius, goes from your outer hip to your inner knee. So if you measure from your hip to your knee, that's how long those cells are because the cells run the entire length of that individual muscle. They are multinucleated because if you're huge, you got to have lots of control, a lot of regulating. So they're going to have lots of nuclei, often hundreds of nuclei. Now, when we look at muscle cells, they just don't magically appear. They have to be built during fetal development. And they're going to be built by cells called myoblasts. So myoblasts would be the stem cells of your muscles. And we learned again, blast means building up, right? So those are our functioning active cells. And myo means muscle. So these are individual cells that build a muscle cell. So if you have a muscle cell, it takes hundreds of myoblasts to build it from scratch. Now, once the muscle cell has completed development, usually in the fetal stage, the myoblasts have options. They could either retire or become upper management. It's like being in the military, right? You can either advance in rank or be retired because you're not going to be a private for 20 years. Okay? So our individuals that become upper management, they become a nucleus. So if you look at a skeletal muscle and it has 150 nuclei, each one of those nuclei started off as a myoblast. So it took at least that many myoblasts to build that cell. And that's half the workforce. Now, if you decide to retire, you don't want to be management, you'll become a satellite cell. So you just live in the connective tissue in the endomysium on the outside of that cell. So counting the nuclei plus the satellite cells gives you the rough estimate of how many cells it took to build that individual muscle cell. Now, those retired satellite cells, if you're healthy and happy and nothing happens, they just hang out there until they die. So it could be a while. Now, if you damage a muscle cell or have to repair or rebuild a muscle cell, that's the job of the satellite cells. Again, this is why they have to be built from scratch or repaired from scratch. So those satellite cells can reactivate and regain their myoblast activity and repair. Just like little old people, if they don't make enough money on Social Security, they can come out of retirement and go work at Chick-fil-A, right? They're so adorable. They're like 900 and they're still working. Like, I'm so sorry that your retirement sucks, but thank you for the sauce. But you can reactivate if you need to. And then things go well, you can retire again. So that's what those satellite cells do, is they reactivate, heal you, and then they retire again. Now, as we get older, we lose satellite cells. Just like in populations, there's less 90-year-olds than 80-year-olds and less 80-year-olds than 70-year-olds because people are dying. Satellite cells die over time. So when you're young, it's really easy to repair muscle damage if you gym binge wrong, because you have lots of satellite cells that can repair. And if you have lots of them repairing at once, they can heal a little bit faster. If you get older and you damage a muscle cell, it's going to take longer to repair because you have fewer satellite cells, which now means instead of 5 cells fixing you, it's 2 cells fixing you. So it's going to take a little bit longer for them to get their job done. So as we age, it gets harder and harder to repair skeletal muscle. And a lot of times we may need surgery to repair if we have major tears because it's just too much work for those little satellite cells. And again, skeletal muscle only contracts underneath stimulus of the central nervous system. If you detach the brain spinal cord from the muscle cell, it won't contract, which is why you get paralyzed if you damage the spinal cord or a part of your brain because it can't communicate with that cell anymore. Microscopic anatomy, so things you have to have a microscope to see. So these are things that we've been studying in lab, so hopefully it looks familiar. Go with the fantasy. Oh yeah, we know all of these things.
We know.
All right, so fascicle, again, a bundle of muscle cells that like to work together as a unit covered by perimysium. Muscle fiber or muscle cell, an individual muscle cell covered by endomysium. Our parts of our muscle cells, we have the sarcolemma. Again, sarco meaning flesh and lemma meaning covering or husk. So this is the cell membrane of a muscle cell. So what we do is if we take a normal cell part and modify it and change how it functions, we give it a new title. Okay? It's just like if you work in a kitchen, you could be a line cook, but if you're specialized to make only the soufflés, you're the soufflé chef. You're fancier. So the sarcolemma has been modified to receive neurotransmitters. So it has a new title. So it's just not any cell membrane. It's one that can receive neurotransmitters and have irritability. The sarcoplasm, that's the cytoplasm of the muscle cell, the cell juice. It is different than normal cytoplasm. Normal cytoplasm kind of stays the same distribution of ions. There's nothing drastic that changes. With muscle, it changes based on the activity. When the muscle cell is at rest, it has very little calcium, almost zero calcium in the sarcoplasm. When the muscle is contracting, it floods with calcium. So you're going to have a change in ion distribution when we're contracting versus when we're relaxed. We also have changes in ion distribution like sodium and potassium when we're contracting and when we're relaxed. So since we completely change the content of the juice, depending on if we're active or not, we call it something different. Myofibrils. These are the contracting organelles. So these are the organelles that we only find in muscle that allows it to have contractility. And myofibrils extend the entire length of the muscle cell. So if the muscle cell is 12 inches long, those organelles are 12 inches long. So from end to end. And they have the bands, A bands, I bands, A bands, dark bands, light bands, dark bands going all the way down. Now, each muscle cell, each muscle fiber can have hundreds to thousands of myofibrils. The more they have, the stronger they're going to be because they have more things that work. And they make up the bulk of the muscle cell. Most of the organelles are kind of shoved off to the side. So you notice on the muscle cell models, the nuclei were right by the cell membrane. They weren't scattered about on the inside because that would interfere with the muscle contracting. And then myofilaments. Myofilaments make up myofibrils. Kind of like it, when you see a big rope, it's made of little bitty tiny strings, right? Yes, go look at ropes somewhere. Heck, look at yarn. Yarn's made of little strings. So fibers are going to be made out of myofilaments. And these myofilaments come in thick myofilaments that are made out of the myosin protein and thin myofilaments made out of the actin protein. Now, when we look at the structure, the bigger the word, the smaller the structure. So it's a happy accident. So myofilaments, board, make up of this.
But I haven't